going to finish up our civil rights unit. We're going to talk about people we lost and programs, okay? Now, if you remember, we just went back. Dr. King was shot at the Ram Motel, okay? Also in 1968, presidential candidate and brother of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, will be shot and killed by a man named Sirhan Sirhan. This had to do with some Israel support, etc. And so he probably would have won president in 68 because Johnson famously says he's not running again because of how bad Vietnam went. Also shot in 1968 is George Wallace's Segregation Now, Segregation Forever. He is shot, and they really don't know who the assassin was. They kind of have an idea, but because of complications from a surgery after the bullet wound, he will pass away as well. Also in 1968, at the Democratic National Convention, we have a standoff between police and protesters of Vietnam that culminates in a massive amount of violence as well, as you can see, right? So for a good reason, we call this the year of coming apart, 68, because, I mean, just this. We lose these three people. We have the stuff going on here. We also have the Tet Offensive going on, and the My Lai Massacre, which we later find out happened in this year. So there's a lot of really negative things, okay? So Johnson decides to do something to help this out. It is called the Civil Rights Act of 1968. It's the last Civil Rights Act we have. Really to remember here, 57, 60, 64, and 68. And it basically said you could not segregate in housing. And so this allows subsidized housing for people who can't afford it to get into a better school or a better neighborhood. This also prevents gerrymandering or building a community where if you don't have enough money, you can't live there. And so it was mainly to prevent segregation in housing, okay? And so there's Johnson with that, all right? Now, in 1971, because of affirmative action, because of federal funding, if you didn't have a good racial balance, you didn't achieve federal status, and you did not receive full federal funding for your schools. And so they came up with an idea that they called busing, and this is where we would go and find a black student who maybe wasn't in there and bus them to a different school to achieve this racial balance to get federal funding. Well, a man named Mr. Swan will sue the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education over this fact. And so two things have to be answered here. Number one, is it constitutional bus? And number two, are racial quotas constitutional? They decide that racial quotas were okay to combat a racial imbalance. In other words, bringing people over by bus to achieve a better mixture of people was absolutely fine in 1971. Okay? And so the whole goal was to achieve something like this. Now the problem is, and you can tell here, by the way, this is Linda Brown with her new classmates. There is a lack of understanding here and a lack of bewilderment because they'd been educated to think that each other was wrong. So, all right. Now we come into a big thing here. There's a man named Mr. Backey, and Mr. Backey goes to apply for law school at the University of California, Regents, and he is denied admission. He claims that it was on the ground of his race, and he says that affirmative action cost him a chance. So two things are at question here. Number one, can race be a factor when you're going to admit people? And number two, are racial quotas constitutional? Now, to give you an idea of what I mean by racial quota, if you've ever seen South Park, there is a token character, right? And so sometimes in society there's a token black guy, token white guy, token Hispanic, token female, etc. It is where you have one person and you have that spot in your friend reserved for that. And so the racial quotas in some way are seen as a token. And so for that reason, they ultimately decided that racial quotas could not be used in the admissions process of a school. You couldn't say, I'm reserving this spot for 3 whites or 3 blacks or 3 Hispanics or 3 women or anything like that. Now the other half of that question, if you remember, the other half of that question was, can you look at race when you are just letting people in? And that answer is yes. Race can be a factor so long as that is not the only factor. Okay? Now, to opponents of affirmative action, they call it reverse discrimination. They say if you reserve for these, you discriminate on these. So reverse discrimination is what critics call affirmative action, okay? So can role play a race and a place in the admissions process? Absolutely, so long as it is not the only thing. Now, a couple of really big people here. Marion Barry is the first black mayor of a major U.S. city. It is Washington, D.C. All right? Jesse Jackson, who was there with Dr. King the day he was shot and a close confidant in SNCC and sit-ins, etc., will be the first black man to run for president. He does it in 84 and again in 88. He loses to Reagan and Bush in the process. Now, beginning in 1988, a very intelligent woman who has a doctorate from a college will protest the Lorraine Hotel. Here she is. And as you can see here, welcome to the $10 million James Earl Ray exhibition. You are about to desecrate the memory of Dr. King. Gentrification is the abuse of civil liberties. Where were the robots in 1968? And here is the woman. Her name is Dr. Jacqueline Smith. All right? And Dr. Jacqueline Smith says that you must boycott the National Civil Wrong Museum. It's a tourist trap. And she says it disgraces Dr. King. She claims that the money, as well as the facilities, would be better used as a community center. And as I said, there the cops take care of her, and she's there almost the whole day, every day. And this is what she has devoted her life to, this cause. All right? Now, in 1990, we have the first black governor. His name is Douglas Wilder, and he's from the state of Virginia. And lastly, in 2008, we have the first black president. His name is Barack Obama. Now, just some current trends and just kind of a closing thought, if you will. Some current trends we see in civil rights is that there are gaps. Okay? And so the first gap we have is an educational gap. If we look at achievement standards of whites and black, there is a gap. Okay? I know what's to be done about that. There's a lot of programs in place and things like that. All right, so number two, there's an economic gap because of that education, mainly, and other factors. If you take a median household of both, you notice that the whites earn more, and some say, well, that's because they have more education. Others say, well, no, it's not, and there's a lot of things there. But the biggest gap we have is an empathy gap. One race is not willing or not able, if you will, to put themselves in the shoes of somebody else and walk a mile for that. And this is the reason we have so much controversy surrounding Mike Brown or surrounding Trayvon Martin or Freddie Gray or any of these people that have recently been in the news. It's because the two races aren't able to empathize with one another and put themselves in that shoe. Famously, Malcolm X said the only way to fix the civil rights problem is we have to be able to sit down at a table and every race explain, not just white and black, but Hispanic and Native American, and just put all the differences on the table. This is what I have wrong with you, and be willing to listen without being offended. The problem is that cannot happen because our society right now gets offended very easily. And so these things are going to continue to occur unless we address these gaps. How do we fix the education gap? How do we fix the economic gap? And how do we fix the empathy gap? And so civil rights, we could see other things coming up with this as we go through it. Now, that's the end.